Hello, I'm Josh Adept from Roaring Penguin Technical Support. In this video, we'll talk about integrating CanIt with your Active Directory server. Why do you want to do this? 3 reasons. First, your users will be able to log into our web interface. Second, CanIt will be able to look up the recipient addresses and choose which spam trap, or stream as we call it in CanIt, to use. This includes mapping aliases to the right stream. Third, we can reject mail to non-existent recipients. If you don't yet understand why recipient verification is important, we have a video series on the subject, so please feel free to pause this one and go check that out now. Don't worry, I'll wait here patiently until you're back. Ready to go on? First, we'll go over the steps to setting up the integration in point form using these slides, and then we'll jump to a live example demonstration of the steps in the web interface. Finally, if you're curious about the gears behind the clock face, at the end of the video we'll go into more technical detail about how CanIt connects to Active Directory and, goes about its business.
This video applies to both CanIt-PRO and CanIt-Domain-PRO for both hosted and on-premises deployments. This was recorded using version 8.1.0. The functionality doesn't change much between versions, but if your experience varies significantly from what you see in this demo, or anything you see here confuses you, please contact Roaring Penguin Technical Support.
Let's go into more detail about why you want to connect CanIt with your Active Directory server. CanIt has several ways to use external sources of information to integrate with your user base, which ultimately means that you as an administrator don't have to manually create users or duplicate anything. External sources of information include LDAP, Active Directory, IMAP, POP3, and last of all, you can write scripts or apps to integrate with whatever sources of information you have in whatever way you want. Active Directory actually uses the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, LDAP, with the attributes and parameters specifically tuned to work with Active Directory. The first benefit is that your users will be able to log into the CanIt web interface using their credentials from Active Directory. Once logged in, CanIt will give them access to the correct stream and set other variables which may become useful in the future. The next benefit is that we take the recipient addresses for incoming email and look them up in the Active Directory to figure out which stream, or spam trap, to use. Remember that in CanIt we use the term stream to mean a spam trap and all the rules and settings that go with it. We also use it as a verb to mean finding the name of the spam trap and the settings to use to process a message, and if necessary, quarantine it. Since Active Directory knows which aliases belong to what accounts, using AD for streaming will automatically map aliases to the correct stream as well. Finally, when an Active Directory user lookup is used for streaming, it includes the ability to reject mail to invalid recipients. If CanIt looks up a recipient address in LDAP or Active Directory and finds that no such record exists, we can reject mail to this non-existent recipient. Note that we only reject mail to addresses that don't exist at all. This is not the same thing as distribution lists, for example info@yourdomain.com, or other addresses which do exist but which don't belong to a particular account. We will accept those emails. We'll see later how we determine which spam trap to use for those. If you have a choice between using Active Directory and, say, POP3 or IMAP, why should you choose Active Directory? First, understand that IMAP and POP3 are only used for authentication. When a user logs in, the stream that they get access to, their home stream, is the same as the login name they use. So if I log in as bob@domain.com, then I have access to the stream called bob@domain.com. For the part of CanIt that decides what stream name to use for an incoming message to a recipient, we use as is. This means that the stream name is the same as the recipient address. We don't chop off the domain part or the user part or rewrite any of it. We leave it as it is. This almost always works out because on IMAP and POP3 systems, the username and the primary email address are the same. However, if a user has any alias addresses, CanIt doesn't know what they are. If Bob also has robert@domain.com, he or his system administrator will have to add an address mapping before he can see what's in the spam trap for his alias. Contrast this with LDAP or Active Directory, where the directory does know which addresses belong to which accounts, including aliases, so it can be used for both streaming and authentication. The home stream will resolve and aliases will be streamed correctly. A well-written program method can be used for both streaming and authentication, and it can be made to do all these things seamlessly as well, but it takes extra work to write the program or script you need. Finally, if you happen to be thinking that you might start out with IMAP or POP3 for now and switch to Active Directory later, I want to caution against this. Remember that they produce different stream names, so a switch later on will mean that the users will lose access to their old quarantines, as well as any special rules or settings that they made in their old streams. Okay, let's get into the technical stuff. In order to complete the Active Directory integration, we need to do three things. First, we need to create the user lookup. This is where we tell CanIt all the details about your Active Directory server. Once we've done that, we'll test to make sure that it works before we move on. Next, we set up domain mapping, which tells CanIt to use the user lookup for streaming incoming mail for your domain, and then authentication mapping, which tells CanIt to use the user lookup for your domain when your users log into the web interface. Note that until we finish the domain mapping and the authentication mapping parts, CanIt will not actually use the Active Directory server for anything, even after we finish putting in the details in the user lookup. The user lookup just provides the server data. The two mapping functions tell CanIt when to use it. Note also that Active Directory is not used for recipient verification unless we use it for domain mapping. This is almost not worth mentioning because just about everyone who uses Active Directory will use it for both domain mapping and authentication mapping, but there might be some odd cases where someone uses it only for authentication and then uses another method like as is for domain mapping, and then still expects recipient verification via the directory. So I'm here to tell you that no, it only uses Active Directory for recipient verification when Active Directory is used in domain mapping. If you are using something else for domain mapping, you'll need to set up an alternate method of recipient verification. Again, see our video series on recipient verification for a full understanding of the options available. To create the user lookup, we'll need four pieces of information. First, the server hostname or IP address. Obviously, we can't talk to your server until we know how to reach it. Don't forget, if your Active Directory server needs to know the IP address of your CanIt server, or your firewalls need to allow connections between the two to set that up. Active Directory uses the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol on port 389. If you want the connection secured and your server supports it, allow port 636 for LDAP secure. You'll need to enter the server value a special way by first putting LDAP:// and then the hostname or IP. If you do want to go the secure route, I recommend first setting everything up to use plain insecure LDAP, and after all the tests passed, then switch to using LDAP secure. Do it this way because LDAP secure adds an additional layer of complexity with TLS and certificates, and if there's problems, we want to know that we have the basics right when we test. Then switch to LDAP secure, do the tests again to confirm the secure part works, and you're good to go. The second bit of information is the base distinguished name. I don't want to get into the full details of LDAP directory structures, but for our purposes, it's enough to say that each account is a unique entry that belongs to a group, and the base DN is that group's identifier. It's usually made up of domain components, for example DC equals domain, DC equals local. It's common for Active Directory components to end with local, rather than using the fully qualified internet domain name. Basically, the base DN is how we tell CanIt, if you're looking for something, this is the group in which you should look. It's always necessary, even for servers whose Active Directory only has one group of users. Your Active Directory administrator should know what their server's base DN is. If not, you can probably guess it by making up the domain components from the Active Directory's domain name, which probably ends in .local, or by using a nifty trick I'll mention at the end of the next slide. The third and fourth bits of information are the bind DN and password. The bind DN is the distinguished name of a user that CanIt will use to connect to or bind to the directory in order to perform searches. A lot of CanIt admins will just go ahead and use the administrator account. It's not necessary to do this. Any regular user account will do the trick. We recommend creating a new user account just for CanIt. One thing to note, if your system has functions that make an account go inactive if it's not used for a while, or that require each account to change its password once in a while, then after a while that account will stop working for CanIt and you'll have problems. Disable those functions for the account you use with CanIt if your server has them. Active Directory will accept some different formats for the bind DN, and if there's a rhyme or reason to which formats work in which case, we don't know what it is. We recommend trying them in this order. First the plain username, then the username at domain format, and finally the distinguished name format. Note that for the username at domain format, the domain should be made from the Active Directory server's domain name, rather than the fully qualified internet domain name. If you're still not sure how to make or find the distinguished name, you can run this command from the Active Directory server console. dsquery -ou base DN. In addition to using those 4 bits of information, when you watch the live example you'll see that there's a bunch of other variables. These variables get preset to the values that work with Active Directory when, during the creation of the user lookup, you select LDAP bracket Active Directory from the dropdown. So once you put those 4 pieces of information in, finish up and save the new user lookup. Next, it's time to test the user lookup. There's 2 parts to the test function. One tests authentication, the other tests streaming. I recommend testing the streaming part first, because if something is wrong, it will be easier to eliminate the problem. To do this part, enter a valid recipient email address and run the test. If all goes well, it should say found stream, followed by the name of the account to which that address belongs. If it doesn't work, examine the error message. For example, if it says it can't connect to the server, the hostname or IP could be wrong, or the server or the firewall isn't allowing the connection. If it says it couldn't bind, then the credentials are wrong, or you need to try a different bind.dn format, or the base DN is wrong. If it binds okay but couldn't find the stream, then it's probably the base DN. If it's a credentials problem, it will probably say something like accept security context error, followed by some codes that make more sense to machines than to humans. I find Google helpful in this situation. If all else fails, contact Roaring Penguin Technical Support. Once you've got the streaming test working, move on to the authentication test. To do this part, enter a valid username and password. Use one that's different than the bind.dns. Try the plain username first, and then the username with the fully qualified internet domain name added. If the latter one fails, go back through the user lookup settings and check the setting that says strip domain name prior to authentication. Now all that's left is to do the domain mapping and authentication mapping. First, let's go to Setup and then Domain Mapping. Put your domain on the left and select the name of the user lookup you just created from the drop-down. Then do the same thing in Authentication Mapping. Finally, log out of CanIt and try logging in with a username from Active Directory. Be sure to put the user ID in with the username at domain format. CanIt figures out which user lookup to use based on the domain. If you have CanIt deployed on premises on your own servers, and you will only ever use one domain, and you'd rather not have to put the username followed by the domain name, contact Roaring Penguin Technical Support for help. I realize that throughout this technical part, I talked about a lot of stuff that might sound complicated and scary, but as with most things, it's actually a lot easier to do than the instructions make it seem. So let's go through that now. Here's the login page for one of our test servers. We'll be using this to demonstrate the steps that we just went through in the slides. So we will start by logging in as admin. And first, since this is a CanIt-Domain-PRO environment, we need to make sure that we're in the right realm. If we did all this stuff in the base realm, we wouldn't be able to use it, so we'd have to redo it all again in the right place, so we might as well switch to the right realm first. Don't worry about this if you're working with CanIt-PRO instead of CanIt-Domain-PRO. Next we'll go into Setup, and then into User Lookups. We'll add a new user lookup, call it RP LDAP. Click Next. And so, in this test environment, we don't actually have an Active Directory server to test against. So in a moment, I'm going to choose LDAP generic here. But just so we can see the difference, I'll click through with Active Directory right now. So, in this area up top here is where those 4 key pieces of information we discussed will go. And these other variables, such as SAM account name, proxy addresses, and so on, are pre-configured with values that work well with Active Directory. So I'll jump back. We'll choose LDAP generic. We'll jump forward again. And notice now that it's got different values in the preset areas. As we can see, though, it's the same system, the same technology. The only difference is that these preset values and options have changed. So once again, the important 4 bits of information go up to the top. We will start with the LDAP server, ldap-test.roaringpenguin.com. Base DN is going to be DC equals roaring penguin, comma, DC equals com. Bind DN is going to be CN equals admin, comma, DC equals roaring penguin, DC equals com, and the password. If we want to use LDAP secure, this is how we would go ahead and do that. We would put LDAP s : in the front. As we discussed in the slide, though, we should set it up using plain LDAP first, go through all the testing to make sure it works, and then switch this after and test once more. So we will remove that. As we discussed, all of these settings should be set pretty much the way we need them, whether it's Active Directory or in this case just the generic LDAP. So we'll click Next, scroll to the bottom, click Finish, and our settings for RP LDAP have been saved. So now we need to go back to user lookups and we're going to run through the tests. First test, as we discussed, we'll test streaming first, so we need to put in a valid email. And I'm going to use dmo@roaringpenguin.com. Run the test. And here's the result, found stream DMO, which is the result we're expecting, so that's perfect. Next we'll test authentication, put the username and the password. I'm just going to leave the test streaming address in there. Since it's non-blank, it will run the test again, but that's fine. Run the test. Authentication successful, which is the result we want. Perfect. And so last thing, as we discussed earlier, we need to test the user login with the domain part included. So DMO at roaringpenguin.com. Run the test. And now we have authentication failed. So, as we discussed, we go back into user lookups, click edit, click through to the settings page, and as we discussed, we need to look for the step, or the setting rather, that says strip domain name from login prior to authentication. We see now that that's set to no, so we'll click it over to yes. Go down to the bottom, click next, go to the bottom, click finish, back into user lookups, back into the test function. Login name, DMO at roaringpenguin.com. Run the test. Authentication successful. That's perfect. So, the last thing we need to do, as we discussed, I keep saying as we discussed, the last thing we need to do is set up the domain mapping and the authentication mapping. We'll go into domain mappings first. The domain is already here. When you create a new realm, it automatically puts in an entry for us. So all we need to do is go to the mapping and select the RP LDAP one that we created, submit changes, go over to authentication mappings. Here we have to put the domain in, roaringpenguin.com, and since the RP LDAP is the only user lookup available, it is already in the dropdown, so all we need to do is hit submit. Finally, we need to log out and test authentication by logging in as our test user. And here we see that login was successful, and it has set the stream properly to the stream that it showed us earlier in the streaming test. So that's it. If we wanted to use LDAP Secure, we would go back through now and we would make the change that we discussed, and then we would just run the 2 user lookup tests once more. So all done, and as promised, a lot easier and a lot less scary than the discussion makes it seem. Way back when this video started, I said we'd go over the nuts and bolts of how CanIt does what it does. Remember that CanIt uses Active Directory for 2 things, streaming and authentication. Remember also that to CanIt, Active Directory is the same as LDAP, with specific variables preset to ones that work with Active Directory. First we'll talk about streaming. Here's how that works. When a message comes into CanIt, we get the recipient's domain, and we check domain mapping to see how we're going to resolve the stream name. Domain mapping says that we're going to use the user lookup, so we bind to the server using the bind-in and password. We search the directory for the recipient address using the search filter provided in the search filter for streaming variable, where %s represents the recipient address. When we find an entry, we take the first value from the attribute given in the attribute to use for stream name variable. If the recipient address is, for example, a distribution list, like info@yourdomain.com, then we might not find a stream name for it. Another variable tells CanIt what to do in this case, which by default is to use the default stream. So now you might be wondering, what happens if my Active Directory server is down? If CanIt can't find a stream and verify the recipient address, will it reject the transaction? No, it won't, because we keep a cache of valid addresses. The cache won't expire for 120 hours or 5 days. If you're running CanIt on premises on your own servers, then this value can be found in Administration, Global Settings, setting G4010. So now you're wondering, well, if CanIt caches values for 5 days and I delete a user, will CanIt keep accepting mail for that user for a week? No, because we refresh the cached value if it's over 12 hours old. As long as your server's up, we'll notice that the recipient doesn't exist any longer. Again, if you have CanIt deployed on premises, this is Administration, Global Settings, setting G4015. Now let's talk about authentication. Here's how it works. When someone gives their username and password to log into the web interface, first we check to see how we're going to authenticate users in this domain. Notice how I said in this domain. This assumes that the user entered a username with the domain added on. If they don't enter their username in user@domain format, then it won't work because CanIt won't know which method to use for them. There are exceptions to this. If you have CanIt deployed on premises on your own server and you only filter mail for one domain, contact Roaring Penguin Technical Support to find out how to set it up so that your users need only provide their username without the domain part. Authentication mapping tells CanIt to use your user lookup for this domain. Then it binds to the server using the bind-in and password. Notice I said bind-in and not the username they gave at login. We search the directory for the account using the search filter provided in the search filter for login authentication variable, where %s represents the login given at the web interface. When we find an entry, we rebind using that entry's distinguished name and the password given at the web interface. If this succeeds, the user is logged in. When a user logs in, CanIt wants to know 3 things. First, what stream does the user have access to? We use whatever attribute value the entry's attribute to use for stream name variable has. If there isn't one, we use the login given at the web interface. Next, if it exists, we set the user's email address from the attribute containing user's email address variable. This email address is currently only used for the locked address feature. Finally, if it exists, we set the user's groups from whatever attribute value the entry's attribute containing group names variable has. Groups are currently only used for permissions. Well, that's it. We now have a full understanding of how CanIt integrates with Active Directory, how to set that up, and then if you watch the technical bits, you know exactly what's going on and you can figure out how to make CanIt work with any LDAP server, Active Directory or not. As always, thank you for watching.
No penguins were harmed in the making of this video, but one was quite vociferous.